All right, all right, all right. So thanks for coming, folks. If we could kind of settle into our private conversations, and we're going to go ahead and get started. If you haven't got any food yet, go ahead and get some. Thanks to Camille for making a perfectly cooked brisket. And yeah, and I'm actually, not to toot my own horn, but I think I finally got the pulled pork right. It was 14 hours, or no, 16 hours on the old bakery day. So that'll do it. I started it at 1 a.m. last night. Anyhow, so just during the presentation today, I know that everybody here has a lot of, there's often the topics we talk about can spur little side conversations, but this room, in case you haven't noticed, it's acoustically terrible. So the little side conversations over in the back and whatnot can kind of become echoey, cavernous conversations. So we're going to have plenty of time to talk about all this stuff afterward. We usually don't leave here until like midnight. So, please feel free to have lots of conversations afterward. But during the presentation, just kind of, of course we'll take questions or whatever, but just keep any side conversations down to a minimum. I'm talking about you, John. That's okay, he's allowed. So, yeah, tonight we have, I've been trying to get our speaker tonight out here to speak for quite a while, actually. Ever since he moved to Atlanta, which I don't know, that was like five years ago or something like that. And I was very excited he was here. I was like, oh, cool, I can get him to come speak at Meetup, but just never really was able to connect with him. And so luckily, life is random sometimes. The reason I was able to get Ben out here is I was heavily involved in the Ron Paul campaign in 2011 and 12. Yeah, baby. And so I actually saw right there, we got a Ron Paul 2012 shirt. Glad to see that. And there was a guy who was going to put on a tour. It was like a revolution tour or something like that. Basically, a bunch of rock bands were going to go around and the country and play to support Ron Paul. It ended up being a complete disaster. But I was in a band at the time, and we would play a bunch of Ron Paul events. And so I was in touch with them, and the guy's name was Zach Carter. And Zach is a super nice guy. We talk on the phone a bunch. I've never met him in person, actually, to this day. But after that Revolution tour failed completely, he kind of disappeared. Everybody's like, oh, what happened to Zach? And then he resurfaced, and he and I just kind of kept in touch over the years. And now I guess he's working with Ben at Isegoria Media, and he hit me up one day. He like joined Telegram or something. I was like, oh, hey, what's up, dude? He's like, oh, hey. He's like, Isegoria, we're really moving on a lot of stuff, And I was like, well, Ben should come speak at the Meetup. And he was like, okay. And next thing I know, it's happening. So, and then to segue into our speaker for the night, Ben Swann, I mentioned the Ron Paul 2012 campaign. That's where I first learned about Ben. He was doing a really fantastic job at, what was the name of the station? It was in Ohio, right? Fox 19 in Ohio. It was an evening anchor there, and he had a segment called Reality Check, and it was amazing. I can't even, when you're a Ron Paul supporter, the media doesn't really do a good job of covering Ron Paul or mentioning him at all, and so Ben was putting out all these pieces and just getting crazy traction, talking about Ron Paul or talking about certain issues with other candidates and whatnot. He also, I think it was during that campaign, he kind of famously got to interview Barack Obama. And that was also just beyond epic. He asked him about the drone strikes and his kill list. And it was very fun to watch. I mean, Obama's a master, so he was able to dance around that. But I wouldn't mind you commenting on that experience and what it's like to stand in front of Barack Obama and asking those questions would be interesting. But fast forward a few years, Ben no longer had that job, came to Atlanta, worked for CBS 46, that was close. And for a few years, and then has since moved on, done some other projects, worked for RT for a while, and now he's out on his own with, and he started a new project called Isegoria and ISE.media, and he's here to tell us all about that tonight. And so I'm very pleased to welcome tonight Ben Swann.
Thank you. So the way we're going to do this is I don't want to go longer than 8 o'clock of what I'm sharing with you. So I want to leave lots of time for questions and you guys to be able to talk about whatever it is you want to talk about. But let me just give you a little bit to that introduction. Appreciate the introduction. For those of you guys who are already familiar with what I do, I can kind of fast forward some of it. But there are some important things I want to hit on in explaining what we're doing now and kind of how we got to the point that we're at now. So you already have some background to it. But yeah, I've been doing broadcast news, broadcast TV for over 20 years. I actually started out as a news photographer and then kind of worked my way up to become what you call a one-man band today. That's what they call them, multimedia journalists. That means you do twice the work for half the pay. That's what that actually means. I was one of the first guys to start doing that because I was trying to transition from being a photographer to being a reporter. And it was all about just taking care of my kids. I got married very young. My lovely wife is here, Jasmine, trying to run that phone camera. And so we got married young and we had kids young and just needed to make more money. There's no great, beautiful story. I had a passion for journalism, no. That I wanted to change the world, no. I wanted to change my world, but I needed to make more money. That's why I became a reporter, became an anchor. And the first time I think that I started to have any kind of understanding that media had value or that you could actually change things or impact things was actually just a couple of years into becoming a reporter. I was working in New Mexico and covered this little girl who was beaten to death by her mom and her dad and her uncle. Won't go into all the details here. It was a truly horrific story, like one of the most hideous things that in my entire career I ever covered. And what we found out, this was in New Mexico at the time, and so I was a bureau chief in New Mexico and 23 years old. And what we found out was that the state law in New Mexico was written in a way that essentially said you could murder your child. If you go into your child's room and decide to choke your child to death, right, you'll be charged with murder. But if you beat your child every day, repeatedly, for days, weeks, months, or even years, and eventually that child dies from being abused, you couldn't be charged with murder. In fact, most people were getting 3 to 5 years tops if they were doing this. And there were a ton of these cases all across the state. And so I was this young kid and you know, trying to report on the story and found out about this stuff and started pushing it really hard to say, well, why does it work this way? Well, it's never been changed, and worked really hard to get the laws changed. And it was the first thing that I had ever done that was, I guess you could consider it kind of being an activist journalist. I suppose that's what I was doing because I said, doesn't make sense. And really pushed it hard, and we actually got the laws changed. Bill Richardson, who's been in the news lately because of connections, reportedly, allegedly, to Jeffrey Epstein, was the governor of New Mexico at the time, and put a lot of pressure on him, put cameras in his face until they signed a bill to change the law. It's called the Brianna bill. And the laws were changed to say, okay, if you murder your child, you can face life in prison, and if you slowly beat your child to death, you can also face life in prison. So at 23, I started to see that, hey, there's like power here, right? Not to yield for yourself, but there's power here that can be yielded for good in journalism. That was the first thing I started to really see. Then, you know, I went years without doing anything really of note or significance, just kind of worked my way up, became a morning anchor, a primetime anchor, working in Texas, my hometown of El Paso. And about 2008, 2009, started covering the drug war in Mexico. That's when the drug war came to Mexico. And it was a wild, wild time. Most deadly city in the world was Ciudad Juarez, which is right across the river from El Paso. About 3 million people lived there. At the time, it was more deadly than Baghdad. There were more journalists killed there than any place in the world. And I was like, let's go every day. Like we would drive across, I would take photographers with me, we'd drive across the river, we'd go cover what was happening there, we'd come back. And I had this epiphany during that time of two things. The first was that the news business made no sense to me. The way that we did business, it made no sense. We would have, and by the way, every station I've worked at a bunch of, every TV station I've ever worked at is not run by journalists. It's run by consultants. It's run by people who are hired to come in and tell you what viewers want to see, how they want you to dress, how they want your hair to look, how they want you to speak, how they want you to look at each other, how long they want you to look at each other. I'm not kidding you about this. Like literally, they will teach you when you're sitting there with your co-anchor to look at them and count in your head, and then look back into the camera, right? Because I want to look like I'm engaged with her. That's the kind of stuff that consultants teach you. And this is literally what they do. And so I remember going every single day across the river into Juarez, and we would drive over. And this was at a time when they would decapitate guys, and then they would tie their bodies up and hang them from overpasses when you drive across in the morning, where they would cut someone's face off, and they would stitch it onto a soccer ball and then kick it into a field, right, to send messages. This was happening every day. This is the stuff that we were covering. And we would come back with these stories, and the consultants and the news directors and the news managers would say to me, no one cares about this stuff. This isn't of interest to people. And I'm like, what do you mean it's not interesting to people? I mean, you have a city of 3 million people being ravaged by a drug war that most media pretends isn't even happening. And that's what was taking place. So I started to wake up to this idea that people who are working in this business aren't acting like journalists. They're not trying to uncover what's happening and present what's happening. They're merely following some formula that somebody has told them to follow. Then, over time, as the public became interested in what we were doing, because we went from being, I don't know, a last place station to now a first place station in a matter of months covering this stuff, because guess what? The public actually did care about it. What we found was then the network started to come down. They started covering it. NBC Network, Fox Network, they would send correspondents down. And these guys would come to Juarez and they would do reports on the cartel violence and how only cartel members are dying. That was a lie. Think about this, a city of 3 million people, and you have 30,000 police officers in that city in a single day were all fired, all let go. You talk about defund the police, they were doing it in Mexico. Now the reason they fired them all was because the way it worked in Mexico, and I'm not gonna go way into the weeds, it takes too long. You had local police, state police, federal police, and military, all operating in the city. Local police belong to one cartel. State police belong to a different cartel. Federal police belong to a different cartel. Military belongs to a different cartel. And they all kill each other all day long, fight each other, right? So if you want to get rid of that, the way you clean up is you come in, if you're the president of Mexico, right? El Presidente comes in and says, we're going to clean it up by getting rid of all of these corrupt police officers. Now, who are you really getting rid of? You're not getting rid of all the corrupt police officers. You get rid of all the competing police officers. So 30,000 cops without a job. What do you do if you're a police officer and there's 30,000 of you and you suddenly don't have a job anymore? You start kidnapping people, holding them for ransom. So that's what they did. Cops started kidnapping people, would run these kidnapping rings. They would be driving around in Juarez. If they saw that you had a car with a Texas license plate, because there's a lot of executives who work in the factories over there, the maquiladoras. If they saw that you had a Texas plate, stop the car, pull you out. Take your cell phone, call everybody on your cell phone, say, I need $10,000 or I'm going to kill this guy by tomorrow. And they weren't kidding. If you didn't send $10,000 or get him $10,000, cut his head off, he's dead. Go find another one. And they kept this up. And this was what was happening. It was a city where violence begat violence, begat violence, begat violence. It completely spirals out of control. Then when you have a city where there's no police officers, there's no law and order, when cartels kill cartels and police kill police, and the only local police you had are now actually the kidnapping rings, what happens when you are just some lunatic who wants to kill some woman and cut her up? There's no one to stop you. There's nobody even know that you're doing it. Do you guys remember in the 1990s, there was a very famous case of something called the Femicides? Have you ever heard of that? In Juarez in the 1990s, 300 women who were traveling from their homes on bus to the factories they worked in, they disappeared in Juarez, right? Became a very famous case. I think Jennifer Lopez made a movie about it at one point. And they're known as the Femicides, right? These 300 women who went missing. In 1 year, the number of women who went missing in Juarez tripled what we saw in the entire decade of the 1990s. And not one single person reported on it. Why? Because that didn't matter. It wasn't the headline. The headline was cartels killing cartels. Why do I tell you all this? Well, because for me, as a reporter and a journalist who every single day went over there and saw what was happening, who myself was almost kidnapped one day while we were over there doing this, and actually made it back across the border before we were kidnapped, saw all this happening and saw the network news coming in and the network guys talking about what was happening and not telling the truth. And I thought, because I was this 29-year-old guy at the time, oh, they just don't know, right? So I would email their producers, email the networks. I was working as the anchor for NBC at the time at the station, so I contacted NBC and say, hey, listen, you guys are missing the story. Here's what's really happening. Here's what we covered today. We're not interested. We don't need your help. Right, but you're misreporting the story. But they didn't care. And so for me, there was this awakening that happened. Wait a minute. There's the reality of what's happening, and then there's what's being said by the networks, and it's not out of ignorance. It's because they had decided what the narrative was, and that was their narrative no matter what. They decided before they ever set foot on the ground. So that for me, that was a huge awakening. At the same time, as I was having this awakening, going back and forth, I was offered a job to go to the most boring city in America, Cincinnati, Ohio, and become an anchor for the most boring station in the country, Fox 19, which, by the way, I love Fox 19. But I was offered this job. And so my family and I decided to go, and we left. And I left the most exciting job in the world to go to the most boring job in the world, because I was literally going from covering drug cartels to city council in Cincinnati. And it was so unbelievably, exhaustingly boring. And so we took this job and we went to Cincinnati, and I had no idea that I was actually stepping into the swing state of all swing states in the end of 2010 and the beginning of 2011, which was the beginning of the 2012 campaign, right? And so I remember one day my boss came to me and said, hey, I want you to consider doing a franchise. So all news anchors do franchises, right? If you watch local news, probably most of you guys don't. If you watch local news, there's always some segment that they'll do that the anchor does to prove they're more than just a talking head. They're engaged and they're also a reporter. And so they said, we have some options for you that come from a consultant, and these are your options. And one was called Pothole Patrol. Would you like to do Pothole Patrol? I said, no, I would rather die, literally, stabbed in the face, more than covering pothole fillings. Or we have this thing that a station in Minneapolis does. It's called Reality Check. And basically, it was actually Michelle Bachmann checks. But remember Michelle Bachmann, the Republican congresswoman from Minnesota? That's all it was. The guy would go and fact check what she had to say. And so it was basically beat up Michelle Bachmann night, is what it was. But fine, so they showed me this thing. I said, all right, fine, I'll do that. I'd rather do that than politics, right? Anything. You gotta pick one. So I picked one. And I did it for a year. And 2011 was still painfully boring. And I was trying to turn it into something and make it somewhat interesting. I remember when the election came around, I said, well, maybe I can take this thing and kind of gear it towards election coverage. And so I did. I geared what we were doing towards covering the candidates, because when you're in Ohio, during an election, especially in 2012, everybody is coming to Ohio over and over and over again. And if you're a Fox station in Ohio, they all want to be on Fox station. So all the Republican candidates were coming through. They were talking. I remember interviewing the now departed Herman Cain about his 999 plan, which he said you could write on the back of a pizza box. I remember asking him how those numbers worked, and he got very confused. He was trying to explain it to me. I keep the video. He didn't understand 999. Nobody did. That's why he didn't get elected. But we would have them all come through. And then after we did this in November, because that's sweeps month, we covered every single candidate. And then I was like, we're going down the list, and oh, there's one more guy here on the Republican side named Ron Paul. Covering him. He's from Texas. I'm from Texas. Texas is a big place. I'd never heard of Ron Paul. Had no idea who he was. Knew nothing about him. Nothing about what he stood for. Just covering him. And so I did a piece called "What's So Wrong with Ron Paul?" And it was basically looking at his positions and how vastly different they were than the rest of the Republican candidates. Like, here's a Republican who wants to end wars. Crazy. Here's a Republican who wants to stop spending into an oblivion. Crazy, right? So the question I was asking was, why is it all so crazy? Why is this guy such a lunatic? I remember I actually had 999 Facebook followers when I went to bed because we laughed at the fact that it was the same as the 999 plan that night. And the next day when I got up, I had 6,000 followers on Facebook. And all these people with like black things over their eyes that have blacked out their eyes saying, thank you for covering Ron Paul. Why would you thank me? Because the media is blacking him out, these crazy conspiracy theorists. The media doesn't want anyone to know about Ron Paul and what he said. These people are crazy, fine. But I started looking at what they were saying, and it turned out they weren't as crazy as I thought they were. In fact, what I started noticing was, oh my gosh, Fox News does a poll of who's leading in the Iowa caucus. And they'll go, number 1 is Rick Santorum. Number 3 is Mitt Romney. And you say, wait a minute, there's a number missing. So you go and look and see who it is. It literally was Ron Paul. He'd be number 2. And so I started having another awakening. Wait a minute. When it comes to politics, the same thing that was happening when we were covering the drug war is happening in politics as well. There's what's really happening and how people really think, and then there's what people are being told. So we started building this segment, Reality Check, based on just covering what was really going on in the world around us and covering things that today I would say these are the least controversial things I've ever covered at the time most. Things like the word blowback. Is it a thing? Is it possible that the CIA actually believes that blowback exists? And if you go and you blow up a country, or you declare war on a country, or you run an operation in a country, maybe the people there don't like the United States because of that and not because of our freedom, right? And it started to send me to a different place and starting to cover it. Well, here's what happened. The way the consultants described it, we've never seen anything like this. You captured lightning in a bottle. All of a sudden, we went from being the last place station to the first place station in Cincinnati. And not only that, but we had people in 140 countries downloading and watching on YouTube the segments we were doing in Cincinnati, Ohio, twice a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays. And it was crazy. So we were watching this happen, and then I ran into my first real opposition within a station, which was our station management, who said, no one cares about this, stop talking. And I would say, whoa. I don't understand what you're talking about. So here's the stuff we're talking about. Here's our ratings. So you would think you live and die by ratings, right? That's what TV stations are about. You want to get ratings, you want people to watch, because that's how you make money. And so what's the problem here? Well, we don't want you to talk about these things. We don't want you to talk about these issues. No one cares about war. No one cares about what's happening in Syria. This is Cincinnati. Leave that to someone else. I'm like, well, I would if they did, but because they don't, I do. And so it works for us, right? We're doing great because we'll actually talk about something people care about. Yes, something they actually care about. So we really started to clash. We started to fight, started having like just knockdown, drag outs of station management. It's getting uglier and uglier. Obama came to Ohio. They came to me. Well, first, Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan came to Ohio, and they invited me to interview them because you're at the Fox station. It's going to be nice and soft. There's 2 rules if you do the interview. Number 1, do not mention abortion. Because remember, there was a Senate candidate who had been connected to Paul Ryan. They didn't like him. And he got in some issue with an abortion, the heartbeat bill. So they said, you can't talk about that. And we know that you're always talking about Ron Paul. We don't want to talk about Ron Paul. Or the delegates, because remember at the time, the Republican Party was stripping delegates who were headed to the RNC. So my news director comes to me and says, hey, we want you to do this interview, but these are the rules. You can't talk about these 2 things. Okay? And I said, no, I'll talk about those 2 things. Well, you can't, because I told them you wouldn't. I don't know why you would tell them I wouldn't. And he said, well, I already gave him my word. And I said, okay, well, that's your word. I didn't give him my word. But if you want to put somebody else on it, put somebody else on it. No, you need to do it. Okay. So we went. First question I asked was, let's talk about abortion. They're like looking at each other. Oh my gosh. They answered. Last question was, before we go, can't let you go until I ask you about Ron Paul and the delegates, because you guys are stripping these duly elected delegates of their credentials, and you know you don't need to. You're going to win it, right? Oh yeah. So that was that experience. Well, as a result of that, a week later, we get a call from the Obama campaign in Ohio who says, Obama's coming to Ohio, and we want Ben Swann. what? Why would you want that? Well, I didn't understand. News director kept running in, he's panicking. Oh, this is great. We're going to get an exclusive. You're going to be the only reporter in Ohio who's going to interview the president. Okay, great. So I drive all the way to Toledo. He's there. I go to interview him. And when we get there, there's this lady who comes out, and she's like the director for Obama's campaign in Ohio, and she is just, I just love you. You're just so wonderful. I got to tell you, because I saw your interview with Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan, and you destroyed them. And I watched it, and I said, that's the guy I want to interview the president. And I was like, oh, well, I really appreciate that. That's great. And she said, so you get, 5 minutes, but, he does tend to filibuster, but I just know you're going to do a great job. And normally we would ask you what you're going to ask him, but I trust you. So that's good. You're welcome in a few minutes. So if it's 5 minutes, 6 minutes from now, you're going to hate me. So we went in, we did the interview with Obama, and it wasn't a get gotcha at all. It was legitimate, serious questions about his kill list, about the death of Anwar al-Awlaki and his 16-year-old son, Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki, both U.S. citizens, both targeted by drone strike, neither had any due process. How does a president, not you, how does any president, because this one was a constitutional scholar, remember, have the authority to do that? We talked about Syria. Why are you funding al-Qaeda in Syria and fighting al-Qaeda in Afghanistan? At the time, that was a crazy question. Isn't it weird how just a few years later, everybody knows it now? So it was no longer a conspiracy theory, but at the time, it was like, what are you doing? So asked him 5 questions, got to the end of it. He hated me so much that when I got to question number 5, as I'm asking him, his eyes started twitching. I thought, oh, okay, let's just get through this one. So we got to the last question. We were done. When we were done, he says to me, I guess you don't want a picture, right? And I said, of course I do. Take a picture with him. It's the president of the United States. I have nothing personal against him. Of course I want a picture of President Obama. But my job is to be my job as a journalist is to comfort the afflicted, right? And to afflict the comfort. That is my job, right? And that's not me, that's George Orwell who said that. But that is what my job is. And we miss that sorely today. We don't have that in journalism today. In fact, what we have is a journalist class who believes that their job is to comfort the comfortable and to afflict the afflicted. That's what we think that our jobs are. It's not. We are supposed to be fighting for those who are afflicted, and we're supposed to be the most painful experience for those who are comfortable, those who are in power. We'll get to that in a second. So we did the interviews, went back to the station. They hated me even more than ever. How dare you not ask him about anything about Cincinnati? Why would you not ask him about us getting a new bridge? And I said, because presidents don't put bridges in cities. Why would I ask him that? Well, because it matters to the people here. Yeah, it doesn't matter if the president can't do it. What matters to people is whether or not you're willing to ask the president about things that he has authority over, right? And as we argued about it, I said, why didn't we just put a Cincinnati Bengals logo behind it? And then you could have gotten your Cincinnati field. That was our clash. So we clashed and we clashed, and I decided to leave. And so I left that station in the #1 spot from which they fell precipitously and quickly. Left them, went out on my own, started something called the Truth in Media Project. Did that for a couple of years, and then was invited to take a job here in Atlanta, which my family came here to work for CBS 46. We brought back this thing called Reality Check. Unfortunately, CBS 46, incredibly stupid in the way they ran their station. They just are. They still are. Sorry, guys. I said I love Fox 19. I don't love you. And there's a couple of reasons for that, but one of the reasons is because here in Atlanta, they would bury it. They take reality check, they put it out at 5:35 in the afternoon where no one could find it, no one could see it. What are you guys doing? And so instead, we just grew like crazy online. We did 130 million video views in 1 year, 2016, on Facebook video. Just Facebook, that's YouTube aside, just Facebook alone. And we were absolutely crushing it. Growing like crazy, had 11,000 new people joining up every single day online, what we were doing. And we were growing like crazy. And then we started talking about things that we weren't supposed to talk about Syria, talking about those so-called white helmets. Remember the white helmets who saved the day in Syria, and the fact that they were being funded by groups that also fund terrorist organizations. The fact that, this Al-Qaeda in Syria concept that we were still fighting, and then ISIS, and how did these guys get trained? And so started covering all these issues on local TV. And so because you're doing it on local TV, people are watching it, we're growing, growing, growing. And then our station management says, after we did a particular story about a particular subject, not barbecue, but I think it was food related, decided to go ahead and say, we're done. So I have actually, we were talking about this on the way over, a distinct position, notoriety, honor of being the first journalist that was truly deplatformed. Because I was not deplatformed by Facebook or by Twitter or by YouTube. I was actually deplatformed by my bosses in Atlanta who said, you will turn off all your social media or you won't have a job. So I did. Turned it off for 1 year. And for 1 year, it was completely dark. No internet presence at all. I'm gonna tell you how insane that is, that there is not a single station in the country that not only tells their anchor to not be on social media, but fights every single day to grow their anchor's social media presence. My problem was my social media presence was so much larger than the station's. It was so much larger than anybody else around us. They couldn't handle that, so they said, turn it off. So for a year, we turned it off. And while that year went on, I looked for a way to come back, maybe to do something else. And then in the late 2017, starting the beginning of 2018, this thing called crypto was going crazy through the roof. Bitcoin was over 20,000, and there was a particular crypto called Dash, Digital Cash, that was doing extremely well and had a treasury system. And I talked with them, and they agreed to fund us coming back and coming independent. So that's what we did. 2018, we came back independently. But when that happened, and I'm incredibly grateful to Dash to this day for that. But as we did that, I started to see something else happening in 2018. We were 2 years into the Trump presidency, and I was noticing that when I came back, so I had had my social media turned off for a year. When we turned it back on, I saw that, you know what? Things are different. When we turned it back on, Facebook was different than it was when we had turned it off. And maybe that's the reason I saw it before a lot of other folks. YouTube was different. Instagram was different. There's something happening because we can't reach anyone. Right? We're doing 130 million video views 1 year, and then we're gone for a year, and then when we come back, we can't get, over the course of months, more than 5 or 6 million. And we're having to pay Facebook to let people see that content. And no one's seeing it. So we started to realize something's happening here. So I started looking at it more carefully. And 2 years ago, we announced this idea of creating something called Isegoria, right? Everyone pronounces it wrong. It's okay. Isegoria is the name of it. It's actually not my word. It's a Greek word. It's the oldest word in democracy that represents this. It means equality in the freedom to speak. That's what literally it means. The Greeks had a concept of Isegoria in their culture that said when it comes to politics, when it comes to public life, everyone is equal in their ability to speak. That doesn't mean everyone's equal in the end result. It doesn't mean that everyone gets their way, because that would be chaos. But it does mean everyone's equal in the freedom and the right to speak. So we said, oh, hey, well, that's the principle that should apply to the tech world, right? That everyone should have this freedom to be able to speak, even if they're wrong. Because guess what? Some people on social media are wrong, and that's okay. Some people are lying on social media. That's okay too. Some people are telling the truth and are being called liars. That's also okay. So what we need is, we don't need to have some tech overlord decide what is true and what is not, and what you can hear and what your sensitive soul can handle. And instead, we should allow this thing called debate, this thing called the exchange of ideas. I'm talking about this 2 years ago, and you know what people are saying? You're an idiot. No one's stopping anyone from doing anything. That's not happening. It's fine. We don't need something else. We're fine. We've got Facebook. We've got Twitter. We're fine. Are we fine? Are we? See, I feel like I'm a little bit of a prophet, because 2 years ago I'm saying this, and now here we are 2 years later, and you guys are telling me we got a problem. Right? We have a serious, serious problem, because it's not just Facebook that's doing it. Now, everyone knows what Facebook is doing now, right? You're deplatforming anyone who's on there you don't agree with. You have this fake system that's set up of these fake fact checkers who aren't fact checking a single fact, right? They're literally taking legitimate information and calling it a lie. And then they're being paid by the people who want it to be called a lie. And that's not seen as a conflict of interest. That's nuts. We know it's nuts. We see it happening. Every single day. USA Today, you're a joke. PolitiFact, you're a joke. The Poynter Institute, you're a joke. All of these organizations that have been set up are a joke. 2 years ago, I was warning people, this is happening. They're saying, no, it's not. And the problem was, what I saw on its way was, and I will say this, as much of a prophet as I was, what I didn't see was the level of coordination that would take place when that switch was really, truly pulled, which happened this summer. It had not been pulled to the extent that it was this summer. Coronavirus comes along, and all of a sudden we see a complete shift. Yes, they're claiming that they're setting everything up because of Trump, but it's not. There was a strategy that was being put into place. And so what we saw happening on Facebook, what you see happening on Twitter, the deplatforming, the fact-checking, all that taking place, that was the first step. But what's even happened beyond that, have you guys seen in the last couple of days? Now email services like MailChimp have decided that they're not going to allow you to send out emails for your email lists if they disagree with you. So there's a Tea Party group in Virginia that tried to organize, just this past week, they tried to organize, it was called Defend the Vote Rally. And they were fighting, over fraud in the election system. And so they sent out, or tried to send out, a blast, an email blast to all of their followers on their email list, which also happened to be controlled by MailChimp. MailChimp shut it down and said, we're taking your list because we disagree with you because you're spreading harmful misinformation. Now, how crazy is this? You own that list. That's literally your property. But MailChimp has the ability to say, nope, it's not your property. We're claiming your property. We're taking it from you, and we're going to lock you out of it. So what do? Can't do anything. You're locked out of that system. Then you have WordPress. How many of you have heard that WordPress, there's a company called Conservative Treehouse that just wrote a lengthy article about election fraud. WordPress removed their website because they disagreed with the message they were sending. See, it's a lot bigger than just Facebook and Twitter. It's a lot bigger than YouTube and Google. It's now reached the point of coordination where it's now you can't even organize. So you have email lists, which is the only way to get around tech companies. Cut that off. Oh, and you have, what was the other one I just said? I blanked on it. Email lists and WordPress. You have a website, your own website. That probably makes no money because Google controls all the ads. But your website is a way to get around tech companies, but if we don't agree with you there, we'll cut you off here as well. So what we're seeing now is just a complete purge of informations and ideas. And so as I said, 2 years ago, we came up with this idea and said what we need to do. Now, today, there are some alternatives that have popped up. Parler is the alternative to Twitter. I hope that Parler is honest in what they're doing and what they say they're doing, right? The problem with Parler, and this is my fear about them, is that it is still controlled by one entity at the very top, and the funding comes from the Mercer family. If you're familiar with that, you might know of Cambridge Analytica and the data mining that took place there. So, not accusing them of that, I'm just saying they have their primary funder has a storied history with collecting other people's data. And then you have, MeWe, you have Gab, you have a couple of other alternatives that have been created on the social media side. What we're looking to do, though, is create something that's a little bit different than that. I would say that what we're trying to become is the alternative to Facebook video, YouTube, and to Netflix, which is to create a place for content creators, video content creators, to come and to create meaningful, valuable information in video form. And that can be all kinds of things. It can be everything from, fictional movies to documentaries to docudramas to daily news reports. It can be whatever you want. But to create a channel system similar to what YouTube has, and then to create a 24/7 stream that's similar to what we see with, like a Netflix or even a cable channel, where we're constantly running video and content. And then when people come and they're users on the site, if you don't want to stand there, there's a seat up here. I won't need to get mad at you. There is what we would create a system that essentially allows you to come in and to watch content and then to upvote that content and move it into that channel stream. So I'm very excited to say that we're actually in development phase right now. We're actually building the site as we speak. We ran a crowdfunding campaign to start it off. We raised about $500,000 from about 1,700 equity investors. So we're doing equity crowdfunding. It's different than doing like a Kickstarter, because when you invest in it, you actually own a piece of it. And so that's how we started doing that. We're in the development phase right now, and we've had this sitting here, and what I want to show you, it's very quick, it's like 2 minutes long. It just kind of gives you a view of what the site is going to roughly look like when it's done. So this kind of gives you an idea of some of the features that are in it. So that is essentially what we're working on creating. So nope, we have not. And what's really exciting about that is we are taking some pretty remarkable steps, because we saw what was on its way in a lot of this. But the other thing that I think makes us a little bit different than some of these other sites is that I mentioned to you in 2018 that I came back with the help of Dash as cryptocurrency. So one of the reasons that's significant is because we are trying to build a lot of the promise of blockchain technology into what we're building. There's two important things that I think you guys would be interested in. One is decentralization of how content is stored and where it's kept. Because we know that in the future, in the very near future, one of those processes that will take place is not just through WordPress or not just through MailChimp, but even attacking the servers that content is stored on. And so there are a couple of blockchain alternatives that are now up and coming that allow you to decentralize all of your servers so they're not in one place. Literally, they are spread out all throughout the world, and in some cases are spread out in so many thousands of locations that there's no way you can ever shut down one server because of how it's powered. The other thing that I think is pretty interesting is I mentioned to you about Parler, and that my concern with Parler is that ultimately, look, the CEO was on Tucker Carlson's show the other night, and Tucker had him on, and, you know, hey, Parler was doing great, it's growing like crazy. But Tucker asked him a question at the end, which I thought was a good question, which is, and, you know, now that you're on the rise, now that you're growing, now that you're doing so well, what happens along the way that prevents you from doing the same thing that Jack Dorsey's doing in Twitter, same thing Mark Zuckerberg did, right? Which is to decide, we own this space and we'll decide what's here and what's not. And his response was, well, I'm not going to do that. Which to me is a pretty shitty response. It's a terrible response. This makes no sense. So your answer is, trust me, I'm a good guy. Well, I don't trust you, and it's nothing against him personally. I don't trust him, nor should anyone trust me when we attempt to build something like this, because ultimately, when one person or one company has power, there are two things that threaten the survival of that company in terms of freedom. One is acquisition, right? Which is some big company like, I don't know, Disney comes along and says, I don't own enough of the world, let me buy yours too. And so they buy up a piece of the world and they turn it into what they want to turn it into. That absolutely can happen. The other thing that can happen is that you find yourself sitting there and you say, hey, you know, I've been doing this thing for a long time and it's not really, like, I'm not achieving the dream that I wanted to have, and so you become compromised yourself and you say, well, maybe you know what I need to do? Just need to start collecting a little more data. Maybe you need to start selling a little bit of that data, or maybe I need to bring in other companies or other investors. And so if the leadership is compromised, then ultimately the whole thing falls apart. And so our goal is to build on this, is to pioneer something that's never been done in a media company before, and that is to actually decentralize the control of the company, the ownership of the company, but also the management of the company, where it becomes a decentralized platform where ultimately the only people who can actually make decisions are users themselves. They are the ones who ultimately become in control. Now, if you're about to ask me a whole bunch of detailed questions about how that's going to work, no, because I can't tell you in great detail how it's going to work. What I can tell you is there are people a lot smarter than I am who have been in this space for a long time, who we're now partnering with or coming in with the express purpose of saying, teach us how to decentralize this platform. Teach us how to make it something that ultimately I cannot control in the future. I believe that's where freedom comes from. It's not from me saying, hey, everyone needs to trust that Ben Swann is a great dude, and I am. We're saying Ben Swann is a guy who's always going to do the right thing. I hope I would. But one day, Ben Swann's not going to be here anyways. And what we want to do is we want to build a company that long outlives anyone who's involved in it now, that long outlives anybody in this room, that ultimately becomes a company into the future for decades, where the technology, and as I said, we pioneer something that says the company doesn't have to be owned by a small group of people and run by a small group of people. Why not create a media company that belongs to all the people? Now, I understand even in saying that, that becomes a huge threat to the systems that are already in place. It becomes a huge threat to people who are in power. And so the more people we involve in what we're doing, the more people who become a part of what we're doing, the more powerful that I believe it becomes. That's why we're working very hard to bring in as many content creators as possible, but also why we started with equity crowdfunding. So that as we launched the company, we started it with the principle of we want to bring in as many people as possible into an ownership structure, so that instead of having one or two people who own it, we have 1,700, 1,800 people who are starting it with us, and it only grows from there. So that's what we're building, guys. I'd love to take questions if we have time. I don't know what time it is because his hair has to front. But tell me, you know, if you have questions, I'd love to answer them. And, oh, perfect.
Probably for profit, say for the channel, will they maybe be funded from their audience or funded from advertisement? It's kind of rough.
Great. So there's a bunch of different models for that. So one is every content creator who comes on board has the ability to sell advertising for themselves on their own channel. They also have the ability to sell sponsorships or advertising, however they choose. Completely up to them. If they want to sell products, if they you know, work with the manscaping guys and do those. You guys watch YouTube, you probably see those commercials. Like everybody's doing those. However they want to do it is fine. They're allowed to do that. On top of that, we're going to create a system that allows us, through users, to actually create. We have a way of being able to actually generate through crypto. Using computing power from our users who are on desktop. This doesn't work for mobile, where it works on desktop. Some of you may be familiar with that idea. So we're actually developing that right now. A share of that goes to all of our content creators. On top of all of that, we do plan to create a treasury system within our platform, similar to what Dash and Smart Cash and Pivots have done, which allows us to fund content creators as well. And the reason for that is because I mentioned the importance of users having a voice. So what we would do is we would actually create a system that allows for content creators every month to come in and say, here are my proposals for content I want to create. Some of our content creators have funding and they have money coming in. Some are with nonprofits, some have connection to big donors, some sell advertising. But then there are some people out there who could create good content, they just don't have any money to do it. So what we want to do is allow for proposals for someone who says, I can't afford to do this by myself, but here's what I want to create. And the community, not me, not the executives who are involved in it, but the community will look at it every single month and will vote on which projects to fund out of the community treasury. And they'll actually have the ability to do that. So we have multiple avenues for how that would happen. Yes?
Blockchain coin?
Say again?
Blockchain coin? Any plans?
So that is the plan right now, is to do some kind of token through blockchain, but we don't know that we'll even create it ourselves. We may just partner with a token that's already in existence and do it that way, which might make sense for us. Right here in the GROUND. Okay.
It's changed the way I look at it, but basically they put up the story and then they show you here's the options, here's the bill, and you look all freedom and you're like,
Right.
yeah. I guess what I'm saying about what's different between now and the market, what's really care? I mean, even if it's man, you love what you're reading, you read it.
Right. What is the harm? And this is a lie that we're being told, right? We're being repeatedly told this lie, that the greatest danger in our society today is someone believing something that's not true, which is crazy. That doesn't make sense at all. I mean, all the people, the same people who will say that are going to go out and tell their children there's a Santa, right? They're going to do that. I know. Someone had to tell you something, dude. But the reality is they're going to go and tell their kids this, right? And they're going to turn around and say, but the idea that someone on the internet someplace is saying something that's untrue is the greatest threat to our democracy and freedom. That, of course, is a lie. We know that's a lie. We're smart enough to know it's a lie, but then we're also dumb enough that when we see that a Facebook fact checker flags something, we skip over it and say, oh, moving along, that got flagged. And I don't know if it's because there is a lack of comfort with the confrontation involved in that, because Facebook makes you say, I would still want to see this post. You sure you want to see it? Yeah? Are you sure? Go ahead, see it, and then don't share it. And so when it starts to almost like you're getting shouted down virtually is what I think is happening.
With this being video content and the possibility of deep fakes, right? So
Yes.
are there going to be any potential security measures, or have you thought about that regarding the possibility of these deep fakes being not even censoring it, but like misinformation, misrepresentation?
So absolutely in the future, launching, it's not going to be a completely open platform. We'll have content creators who apply to become content creators. We have about 200 of them. So they would have to go through a process of doing that. And yes, as far as our terms of service, we're not a completely anything goes. Like obviously we're not going to have child pornography on here, murder videos, suicide videos, deepfakes would be one of them as well, if it's truly inauthentic. But see, and I think that's important. I'm glad you brought it up, because deep fakes is a term that's constantly used in the media today, like it's a real problem right now, right? It's like, you can totally tell that's not Obama's mouth moving, the guy in Key and Peele who does it. But the point is that that's not the stuff that they're censoring. It's absolutely not the stuff they're censoring. Go ahead. Oh, did you have one?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess I'm just, forgive me if I get technical here, but
sure.
I guess I'm curious about how this share system works. Like his point about, there's going to be a blockchain, if there's going to be a token or something that you might have. Is this the kind of thing that you foresee people explicitly buying into? Like, I specifically want to buy 1 share or 2 shares of Isegoria. Or is this the kind of thing that people get, awarded over time as they upload stuff? How do you perceive it?
So I think the way that we're looking at doing it right now is tokens are primarily used for tipping content creators and in the treasury system. So everything basically, as we're kind of seeing it right now, lives within that ecosystem. You don't necessarily see people trading it outside or selling off those tokens outside. We'd also have to put some measures in it so that you don't have the ability to sell off enormous amounts of tokens to like a Disney or Netflix who can say, oh, now we get to control the content. So it's going to be designed in a way that allows for things to happen within the ecosystem without it becoming a few whales who control it.
That was kind of going to my next question about whales. So I mean, out of curiosity, this might border into the too technical territory, but do you foresee there being a conflict of interest there between okay, we don't, obviously on the one hand, we don't want a whale to control the network because we don't want the the Rupert Murdoch or the Ted Turner of cryptocurrency to suddenly take over your platform.
Yes.
But on the other hand, we don't want to say, you know, you can't sell this to your friend or sell this to somebody else. I mean, how do you perceive finding the balance?
So I think that, and again, this is all preliminary, but the way I see it is the balance is not what you can and cannot sell, it's what you can and cannot buy at a certain point. So at a certain point, you've hit a limit of what you can own. So glad you own the maximum amount, that's awesome. But that's your maximum, so you can't really own beyond that. Now, you know, if other people, I'm not telling you you can't sell, what I'm telling you is, that guy's at his limit, right? He's too fat as it is, so now you gotta go to find somebody else. Get somebody else who's involved in it, and find someone else who's interested in buying it. But if one person has an incredibly large appetite to buy up lots and lots of tokens, don't need it, right? And I know that, listen, there is in reality, if anybody's about to pull some free market card on me, I'm libertarian, I believe in the free market, but I also believe that in the marketplace, specific businesses operate in a way that makes them work. That's not a lack of free market principle. That is, the free market principle says if you don't like this way, then you build it a different way and you compete with us. Not we have to make it open so that everyone can do whatever they want.
I have a question.
What do you mean? I don't understand. Oh. So, because it's a step process. So we're launching with a certain set of content creators, but we won't remain that. So over the course of 2021, phase 1, we bring on content creators because we're really trying to not be a BitChute. That's what we're trying to not be. So BitChute already exists. If you guys have ever been to BitChute, it's a video dump site, right? Which there's nothing wrong with. It's not a criticism. I think there's a place for that in the market, but we don't want to be a video dump site. So what we want to do is we want to launch by having specific content creators who've been purged from other places but have content to share. And then over time, it opens up so that anybody can become a content creator. But there's a difference between being a user on the site and being a content creator. A user can come on, they can share, they can engage with video, they can share videos, they can be involved. But a content creator has certain responsibilities that fall on them as a content creator. And that includes certain terms of service and what you can and cannot post. Again, loose stuff like you can't, put videos of people committing suicide and that kind of stuff. So we're not a truly, before anyone asks this question, we're not a truly free speech, anything goes platform. That's not who we are, that's not what we are. But what we plan to be is a platform that is far more open than existing platforms right now. And what we won't remove content for is because it's not something we particularly like. If there are legal issues surrounding it, obviously we can't have it up, but that's, Say it again?
What about online reviews?
I just couldn't hear you.
What if I don't like the legal issues?
Oh, and you're absolutely welcome to do that, as long as you don't commit a crime while talking about the legal issues. Right? You can absolutely say, I think that blank should be legal. Absolutely. What you can't do is say, I think child porn should be legal. There's some child porn like that. But it's a good thought exercise. I know this guy wants to keep going. I can tell.
The path that you kind of walked us down was things are getting worse. They will get more worse.
Yes.
More worse. Sorry.
More worse.
And what you mentioned was, it started kind of like Twitter, Facebook, and then went to a little bit lower level with WordPress and more with MailChimp.
Yep.
And then you're alluding to it going even lower level to servers being hosted where the data is and stuff like that. My question to you is, what makes you think that it would ever get to that lower level where I can't roll my own, it will be censored by like ICANN or something, or like what makes you think it'll actually get that bad?
Oh,
Because I don't know if there's any precedent.
There's not precedent, but there is a precedent for certain sites that host servers like GoDaddy, for instance, has already removed people's websites from their servers. So I think. But
again, that's no different than a hosted.
Right, I think Gab was removed from servers, weren't they?
Yeah.
Right. But didn't Gab get removed from their servers and they had to go find new servers out of the country? Is that what it was?
I guess what I'm more curious about is is someone like an Amazon web server going to
Oh,
say, hey,
absolutely.
we're banned from all of our regions for hosting?
Absolutely. If you're building anything, and that's a great example. If you're building anything on AWS, if you're building anything on Amazon's property, they absolutely will do it. And as again, an example, Amazon's doing it right now with their publishing services. There's a woman who wrote a book. You guys might have heard about this a few months ago about the issues of trans girls, young trans girls. She wrote this book recently, and it's a pretty scientific book, and it looks at the emotional issues that go along with this. Amazon didn't like the book. It was doing extremely well, actually. Amazon didn't like the book and removed it and said, you can't publish it. And so they took away her ability to publish it. In fact, she just did a couple of interviews about this. My point in saying that is that the concept, the wrong question is, will this form of technology fall under the censorship that we're seeing? That's the wrong question. The right question is, what is the belief system that is causing first big tech companies, then these lower level companies, possibly even lower than that? What is the thought process or the belief system that's causing this to happen? That's the right question. Because it's not an issue of technology, it's an issue of ideology. Technology is following the ideology of people who say, there are people who think the right way, us, and there are people who think the wrong way, them. And our job in society is to decide what people can and cannot hear. It's happening every single day, and it's accelerating because the public is accepting it. The public is saying, hey, Facebook is saying what I can and cannot see, but I keep using Facebook. The public is saying, Instagram's telling me what I can and cannot see. TikTok's telling me what I can and cannot see, but I'm going to keep using it. So as long as there is not a price to pay, then they'll continue to do it. Now, when you get an alternative, like for instance, a Parler and Twitter, my hope is that as Parler grows, and I hope they continue to grow, Twitter finds themselves becoming insolvent financially and falls apart. My suspicion is they won't. They'll find money because the money will come from the people who benefit the most financially from creating a system where corporations tell you what to think and everybody else is subjugated to it. They'll magically find the money.
Real quick, to counter that would be, with the canary there to prove how like what you're saying is like Infowars.com.
Right.
I mean, because they haven't been taken down.
So they exist right now on their own personal platform.
But you're saying you even think they will be?
Absolutely.
They won't be allowed to have a public presence on the internet.
So who other than I did, if you saw this, but who other than a few of us even complained when Alex Jones got taken off? It was considered highly justified by most people.
I think there's a lot of crypto personalities that talk about this.
They did, but I'm saying that because the majority of especially media people, including conservative media, did not complain about it. Now they're all getting purged, and now they want to complain about it. But you didn't speak up for this guy when he was getting taken down. And whether you like him or not, it doesn't matter whether you like Alex Jones or not. What matters is the principle behind it that says this man does not have the right to speak. And so, again, I think you're going to see,
on the platform.
Yeah. But that's all right. But it does. I think we're going to see that happen. The question I would ask you to think about is, why wouldn't that happen? Not why would it happen? Why wouldn't it? If we're sliding down this hill, why wouldn't we get all the way to the bottom? What would stop that from happening?
Because I'll tell you what,
Go ahead.
if you host the servers on AWS, they make a ton of money off of it. Whereas Facebook makes money one way or the other.
I think Jack Dorsey's core beliefs are.
Go ahead.
And an invasion of our privacy and exploited. What other issues do you see being important cyber realm?
Oh, I think I feel like I'm being led here. Am I being led into a talk about elections and voting? Is that where we're going? Because I feel like we're headed in that direction. And yeah, there's a huge problem. I've been talking about that since 2012 as well. And by the way, vote flipping has existed since at least 2012 because there were records of it happening in 2012. But that was in primaries, not in the general. Go ahead.
I'm just asking what other
But I do want you to talk about the, I think people were confused about what you said about Crystal Lodge, right? And so that is the Night of Broken Glass.
Not people, just him.
Well, did you guys know what it was?
No, just that one guy.
Oh. You didn't know what it was? Well, yeah. So Crystal Lodge is the night in, correct me if I'm wrong, the night in Nazi Germany when they came in to start arresting Jews, correct? Right, so it's called the Night of Broken Glass. It's the night when the Nazis officially started arresting Jews. So I think what he's talking about is like cyber, the night that they inserted cyber, turn on everyone and seize it, right?
Yeah. Now, TV. Yeah. Great confidence to say that. And you're like choosing a different model from what works.
Well, it's not that we're choosing a different model than what worked. We're choosing a different model than what exists currently. So there are a lot of places where people can go and just create that video right now. The reason we're doing it differently is because what we see is there are a number of content creators who have no place for their content that's already in existence. And so we know that, or I should say we believe that we have to ramp up what we're doing. That we can't just turn it on one day and then everyone just jumps into it and everything works perfectly. So it really is a step process of ramping it up. And eventually hitting the point, yes, where the best content creators are people who just go on and they find their voice and they're able to do it. We want to be there, but we're launching it in a different kind of way. So we are not dependent on it, but we are recognizing that that's going to be reality, which is why we're working through a blockchain system for payment as well. Do not want to be using any kind of banking system for this way. So we are working with a couple different groups right now to build what that system will look like. But we're not building it. We're not building it from scratch ourselves. We're using existing systems. I wish I could tell you more about it, but that's where they are right now. So yes.
So, with MailChimp, do you have a sense that maybe part of it is them just trying to get in ahead of the curve where they're trying to shut it off before the government comes in and busts their ass out? And I ask that question because part of the problem we're running into in America is I'm fine voting to take your rights away. I just don't want you to vote to take my rights away. And we won't speak up for the other guy's rights. And that's why these guys are being taken off now, is that, if I don't agree with you, then I'll just stay quiet. Or if you compete with me, I'll just stay quiet. We've got to come together and say, everybody should have their rights, whether I agree with you or not. But that's not where this country is. And so MailChimp is going, I got to start pulling these people off before the government comes in. I'm just asking, do you think that might be part of it?
So I don't know anyone at MailChimp, so that could be the case. I would highly suspect that's not the case. My personal belief is.
But don't you think that Facebook wants to be open? It's just the government's coming in and
no, absolutely not. No, because here's the thing: is that the stuff that Facebook is taking down, it makes no sense in terms of what Facebook says they're taking down versus the reality of what they take down. They say they'll take down content to protect the election from the Russians stealing it. Then they'll turn around and they'll do more to impact the election than any other company in the world.
There was a time when they were taking nothing.
Right.
Until the government started.
So the question becomes, and this gets a little bit down the rabbit hole, we don't have time for all of it. But the question becomes is why was Facebook created in the first place? And how long has Facebook actually been working in coordination with government entities? And so that's a deeper question. But there is another question there, which really comes down to, and the question of, does Facebook even have a right to take it down? Because people will say, oh, they're a private company, they have a right to do so. Problem is, what you just said about government, a lot of what Facebook is doing is being done in coordination with government agencies, whether it's DHS, that's true, or with sitting lawmakers, people like Adam Schiff, right, in California, who specifically will tell Facebook, take down these groups, take down this content. The problem is that when you do that, there's a legal argument that's being made right now by Children's Health Defense, which is essentially that when you do that, you've now crossed the line from a private company imposing on a freedom to speak to a government imposition on freedom of speech. So that's the argument that's being made in court right now. We'll see where it goes here, and then no here, and then we got to go, right? We're not done. Go ahead. Oh, good.
Yes. rules about anonymity, or I just also, what are you gonna do for the countries and the places where they're saying you have to curate your content, and because it's gonna be spread everywhere, it's gonna be on.
Right. So obviously, as we launch it out, we have to follow whatever the laws are in the countries that impose those laws. The question becomes, you know, coronavirus and what's been happening creates a different situation because you have people being arrested in certain places or charged, like maybe thinking like in Australia, for instance, right? That woman who was organizing a rally and the cop showed up at her house and said you're inciting violence, so we're going to arrest you. So there are huge questions legally about freedom of speech worldwide. It's not just here in the United States. We can't necessarily answer all those questions. What we can do is we can create a platform that allows people to speak. And then when they do speak, hopefully, we're able to fight alongside them rather than being the ones who are turning on them. The problem that we're seeing from a lot of these companies, and I know your question about how anonymous can somebody be, I don't know that yet. Certainly in our first round of content creators, I will tell you, nobody's anonymous. We know who they are, they're coming, and they're applying in order to be on there. When we have that process kind of play out, do we allow for people to be anonymous publicly? Sure. Can they be anonymous from everyone? No, because you have to have some accountability for what you're putting up. I mean, if you turn around and you start posting, you know, ISIS beheading videos, and then you have legal issues there too. So I wish I had a better answer for you. Probably not the answer you wanted. You said you had a great final question. I'm ready to be rocked. Here we go.
Whether it's Facebook or Twitter or CBS or Fox or FTC or any other market that's in the audit, do you feel any sympathy for them and the fight they're going through on trying to do this right?
Are you being serious? Are you being serious? Well, but it's not just Zuckerberg. It's actually not. Right. Right. No, you're right. So the reason I don't feel sympathy, and I don't. The reason I don't feel sympathy is because if there were any sympathy in me at all, it's for the evolution of stupidity that's taking place. And I don't say stupidity like they're ignorant, they're stupid people, they're ignorant people. They're ignorant as to the things that they probably at one point in their life believed as an ideal, that people should have certain freedoms, that people have the right to say what they want to say, right? They are literally sacrificing all of those beliefs. Content moderators who are saying, hey, I've been given a tiny bit of power. Well, I see what they're doing over there, so I'll do it too. Right? There is a lot of collusion that's going on. If you guys saw the Senate testimony yesterday when no, the other one from Missouri, Josh Hawley from Missouri was questioning Mark Zuckerberg. He was asking him about two different platforms they have. One is called Tasks platform, which allows for Facebook, Twitter, and Google to actually have content moderators communicate directly with each other about what people, what ideas, and what hashtags to censor and remove. Right? They're colluding together. We've had to listen to 4 freaking years about Russian collusion, but in fact, tech companies are literally colluding every single day to say, hey, this person, I don't like their ideas. Let's get rid of them. Let's work together to make sure that they have no voice. So the reason I don't sympathize with them is because those companies are making active decisions every day from the content moderator level all the way up to the CEO every day to say, you have a different point of view or a different belief system than I have, therefore I have a right to stop you. I have a noble responsibility and duty to stop you. If I do feel sympathy, it's for the fact that these people no longer realize that they have sacrificed the very thing that I would think they would hope for their children and for their children's children, that one day they would be able to speak freely in society and move about freely in society, have a job, even if you disagree with your employer and the positions they take. We are literally moving into a totalitarian state that says if you have a belief system, you don't have the right to work, you don't have the right to make money, you don't even have the right to make here. That's where we're moving. And what's happening is the more people accept those ideas, the deeper we go. So you had a great question, and to answer your question about how far will we slide down this hill, that's how far we'll slide. When we continue to accept the idea that removing or purging people, not just from social media, but from all of society based on their belief system, that is a noble cause. It is not. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Ben Swann. Fantastic. Thank you so much for coming. He's got 3 teenage boys at home, and if he's here much longer, he's not sure that he'll have a home to return to. So he's got to jet out, unfortunately. But this has been a fantastic talk. I'm so happy to have had Ben here. And just on a sidebar, if I can add my personal commentary, this First Amendment thing, it's first for a reason in the list, and it really is a huge problem that we're facing today, and I really do wish Ben the best of luck. I think you can still invest in his platform if you find it interesting, and then also just check out his website, ISE.media. Hey Oleg, do you want to say something about free speech? Because Ben was talking about this situation, this totalitarianism, and my good friend Oleg here is, do you guys want to hear something? Oleg's from Russia, okay? And his family was persecuted in Soviet Russia, and he has some interesting things to say about First Amendment. Does anybody want to hear about it? Or are you guys simply you want to explain it? Okay. Come on up, Oleg. I'll turn off the Zoom for you, okay? Okay. Zoom watchers, he's not comfortable with this being broadcast live, so I'm sorry this is why you have to come in person this time. I hope you enjoyed it, and have a great night.
There are benefits to attending events live, and there are disadvantages to, I guess, not attending certain events live. Thank you, Rich, for turning this up. Anyway, I don't want to